In our previous class, we dealt with the issue of Taryag, the number 613. We raised some fundamental questions, whether or not the number 16 has roots from the days of the giving of the Torah at Sinai. What about a listing? From where do we have a listing, or do we have a listing at all for the 613 commandments? And we saw that there is a midrashic statement mentioned in the commentary of Rashi in the book of Breshit to Parshat Vayishlach, that Yaakov, our forefather, observed 613 commandments. Today we're going to look at a Talmudic source, which for many becomes an ironclad source, indicating that indeed the sum total of commandments from the Torah itself adds up to 613. This can somehow be borne out by an interesting reading of a verse in the Torah itself. The Talmud tells us, and it's found in Tractate Makot, page 23b, and there it reads that one of our sages, Rav Simlai, makes the following comment. 613 commandments were given to Moshe at Sinai. 365 of them are negative commandments, and they correspond to the days of the year. And 248 of the commandments are positive commandments corresponding to the organs of the human body. A very interesting breakup of the don'ts and the do's. And then the Talmud continues by providing a proof text, which comes from the very, very end section of the Torah, from the end of the book of Dvarim. A famous verse, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe was the instrument to command us the Torah. We know Moshe receives the Torah from God at Sinai. Moshe then becomes Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, and he is the one who gives over the word of God to the nation of Israel. What happens here in the Talmud is we start playing with gematria, which means numerical equivalent. The word Torah, Taf, Vav, Resh, He. Taf, Vav, Resh, He indicates that there's a number 400, there's a 6, there's a 200, and there's a 5. And that all adds up to 611. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us the commandments adding up to 611. However, here comes the surprise. There were 2 commandments that Moshe did not give over to the nation of Israel directly. But we heard 2 commandments directly from God at Sinai. And they were the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the commandment to believe in the existence of God. And not just to believe, but to exercise our intellectual faculties in trying to prove, understand, coming to grips with the reality of God. And as Maimonides, Rambam teaches us, that this is an ongoing commandment. It's not that someone at age 13 or 14 says, all right, I believe in God, let's move on. Rambam believes this is a commandment that commands us to engage in this intellectual exercise day in and day out. And the flip side of that commandment is the second commandment of the 10 commandments. Lo yeh lecha elohim acherim al panai. We will not tolerate any foreign deity, whatever it may be, which is obviously the cancellation of the first commandment. And therefore you have the positive mitzvah, the positive commandment of the belief in the existence of God, and the negative commandment, rejecting any type of belief that's other than our God. And these 2 commandments, according to tradition, and it's implicit in the verses and in the middle of the book of Shemot as well, we heard them directly from God. And now all one has to do is take out one's pocket calculator and add it up from 611 and add another 2, and we come up with 613. And the Talmud concludes and says, from here we see that 613 commandments were given through Moshe at Sinai. This is a very, very powerful and telling statement, because while the you do not have a direct comment in the Torah itself, but using one of the tools of understanding Torah, and that's called remez, indications and allusions, we somehow get the picture that the 613 commandments are directly from Sinai. And the one who picked up on this and said, this is a bona fide source that's unequivocal and unshakable, is Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the famous Maimonides. And let's say a word about the Rambam and his activities with regard to the number 613, because this is going to be critical in understanding the book that we would like to study in the course of this session and these sessions, the book of Chinuch, the Sefer HaChinuch, book of education. There was no list passed down from Moshe throughout the generations. We have no recollection, no national recollection of any list by Yehoshua, by the prophet Shmuel, Samuel, by King David, no listing whatsoever, and no tradition as to precisely what the 613 commandments were. Even when we are now in the era of after the Second Temple era, and we have the Mishnah being compiled, and then we have the Talmud being compiled, and this is a span taking us already up to the 6th century, we still do not have a full listing of the 613 commandments. What we do have within the world of Talmudic discussion is occasionally disputes as to whether this particular verse is indicating a biblical commandment or whether it's just part of the biblical narrative and that's where it ends. You have disputes. And if you have disputes between amongst our great sages, this means that amongst our great sages there must have been different listings of the precise 613. And this opens up the whole Pandora's box as to whether indeed the 613 are from Sinai. So we can come to some type of a compromise by saying, yes, the number 16, 613 is from Sinai. However, the precise details as to which of the verses of the Torah radiate a commandment and project the commandment of one of the 613, that's subject to discussion. And to this end, we're going to see how this plays itself out. Because the very, very first pioneering effort in trying to organize the Talmudic material into a listing of the 613 was done in the 7th century by the author of the Halachot Gdolot. This is a period that we refer to as the Geonim, the period where in modern-day Iraq, which was then Babylon, Bavel, we had the great yeshivot, and they ended up in the city of Baghdad. The head of the yeshiva was known as the Gaon, and that was the title of the entire period, the Gaonim, for about 500, 600, 700 years. Here we have a 7th century work, and I say again, a very pioneering effort in organizing the material under one roof. Here are the 613 commandments. Now, what ultimately happens is that the listing of the Halachot Gedolot, a very, very important halachic work that we're not exactly sure who's the author, and therefore we prefer to refer to him simply by his abbreviations of the book, Baal Halachot Gedolot, the author of the Halachot Gedolot, or Bet Hey Gimel, Bahag. So the Bahag, the author of the Halachot Gedolot, in this pioneering work, gives us 613 commandments. The problem is that in his listing of his 613 commandments, he includes commandments that are clearly rabbinic in understanding and in background. For example, the lighting of Hanukkah candles appears in the list of 613 commandments. The reading of the Megillah on Purim appears in the listing of the Bahag of 613 commandments. If this is the case, then the number 613 cannot be the total amount of commandments that were given to us at Sinai. Could we entertain the thought that Moshe, at the time of the giving of the Torah, already anticipated a historic event that would bring about the institution of a rabbinic commandment like reading the Megillah on Purim, or like lighting Chanukah candles for 8 successive nights from the 25th of Kislev onwards. Would this be possible? The thinking is that if the Bahag included commandments that are of rabbinic nature, he at least did not think that the 613 date back all the way to Sinai. Now this is a very serious question, because it already cuts into the fabric of some of our basic tenets. We all grew up understanding that 613 are from Sinai. And who gave us that understanding? Who inculcated into the minds of the Jewish psyche for so many generations that 613 is from Sinai? It was Rambam, Maimonides. Because Maimonides, 500 years after Halachot Gedolot, after the Bahag, stands up and challenges the list of the Halachot Gedolot and says that in order to understand which commandments belong and which commandments are rabbinic and they don't belong to the listing of the 613, we have to organize a book, and we are going to show and demonstrate the precise listing as the Rambam understood, and we will introduce this book with the rules and regulations. And rule number 1 is only a biblical commandment belongs to the list of 613. If it's rabbinic in origin, it's not in the list. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be careful about it. We're careful about rabbinic commandments as well. However, part of the 613, this would only be the commandments that are biblical in nature. So says Rambam very emphatically, and he will quote the Talmudic section of the Tractate Makot as his proof to this. You see that our sages come out very clearly and say that 613 commandments go all the way back to Moshe, and it is impossible to entertain the thought that there would be 613 commandments that would include rabbinic add-ons. So here you have a very fundamental dispute. And it should be made clear that from the days of Rambam, which is 800 years plus, in 12th century, Rambam dies at the very beginning of the 13th century, people would not take seriously any longer that attempt of the Halachot Gedolot, the Bahag, to see the 613 as incorporating rabbinic add-ons. But to be fair, a pioneer in any sphere of life always deserves the credit of being a pioneer. I would tell you that I once traveled to the city of Luzern in Switzerland, and I went to a transportation museum. And they had there a pavilion for aviation. And at that pavilion, they had a scale model of the first airplane that was flown by the Wright brothers at the very, very beginning of the 20th century. That initial flight lasted for 15 seconds. And yet I stood there and saluted the Wright brothers. I said, fellas, if not for you, we wouldn't be able to get here today. If not for that first 15-second flight, the whole aviation idea would never have come about. And today, obviously, it's so much well developed. So too, Bahag took the first steps. He was the one who was brave and daring, and he produced what he produced. The fact is that 500 years later, Rambam challenges him. Ultimately, Rambam's view prevails amongst the Jewish people. But that doesn't mean that we're going to write off the author of Bahag. We must give credit where credit is due, and that was a very, very, very important step. And then just take matters another step, 100 years after Rambam. Now we're in the 13th century. Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides. And Ramban decides to take a very serious view at Rambam's Book of Commandments, Sefer HaMitzvot. And he challenges at the outset whether the 613 goes back to Sinai. And he opens up the whole matter to discussion once again, 100 years after Maimonides. But then after a very lengthy, wordy essay, Ramban comes to the conclusion, Rambam's right. The 613 are from Sinai. However, Ramban Nachmanides is not willing to adopt the entire listing of Rambam. And we have many, many disputes between Rambam and Ramban, Maimonides versus Nachmanides, as to the precise listing of the 613. And this makes matters somewhat difficult for later scholars who will deal with the subject of 613 commandments. Let me just conclude with some examples of what would constitute a dispute between Rambam and Ramban. So, for starters, is there a commandment from the Bible that a Jew must pray at least once a day? Rambam Maimonides includes this as one of the 613 commandments. Indeed, there is a commandment to pray once a day. Exactly how to pray, what to pray, this the rabbis will tell us later on in history. But the concept that once a day, once within a 24-hour time framework, you should look at God, turn to God, say something, ask of something, this is biblical. Ramban Nachmanides challenges this and says, no, I'm sorry, there is no such thing in the Torah as a obligatory prayer on a daily basis. So here you have tit for tat. You have Rambam including and Ramban deleting. So you have you have a problem here. Ramban is now 612. Well, there's compensation. There are going to be commandments that Ramban includes and Rambam does not include. For example, the very mitzvah obligating a Jew to settle the land of Israel, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, features as a very, very important inclusion of Ramban Nachmanides into his listing of the 613, whereas in the Rambam's listing, it's just not there. And the question is, and the impact is enormous, does that mean that a Jew who resides today in Eretz Yisrael, who takes the bold step of making Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, according to Rambam, there's no mitzvah, no commandment being fulfilled whatsoever? We will see, and I would like not to anticipate at this moment, that there is a fulfillment of a commandment, even according to Rambam, but it's not part of the 613. Why? Rambam has a policy as to which commandments belong and which commandments do not belong. And all this background will carry us into the entire discussion of what the book of Chinuch, Sefer HaChinuch, is all about. Here we have an individual from Barcelona, Spain, who's clearly in the religious orientation and Torah orientation of Ramban Nachmanides, yet he will write a book on mitzvot, on commandments, that follow the scheme of Rambam. So we have an author of a very, very important book that will keep both Rambam and Ramban in mind as we will plow through this book and chart our course in understanding the 613 commandments of the Torah. Thank you.